In the year 476, a Roman general took a small boy from his throne. The boy's name was Romulus, the same name as Rome's legendary founder. His father dressed him in the purple robes of an emperor, hoping the name alone might save him. It did not. The general spared his life, out of pity or contempt, and pensioned him off to a villa on the Italian coast. And with that quiet, almost gentle act, the Western Roman Empire, the empire of Julius Caesar and Augustus, of legions and aqueducts, simply ceased to exist. Historians would later mark this as the fall of Rome, but 800 miles to the east, in a city of marble and gold, a Roman emperor still sat on a still-functioning throne, wearing the same title, ruling by the same laws, utterly unaware that anyone would one day say Rome had fallen at all. How did half an empire survive what destroyed the other half? And how did it go on to survive for another 1,000 years? Hello and welcome to Europe After Midnight. Tonight we will tell the story of the empire that time forgot to end, the Eastern Roman Empire, which we now call Byzantium. We will meet an emperor and a former actress who rebuilt a city from the ashes of a riot. We will watch a blind general reconquer half the Mediterranean and stand beneath the largest dome ever built by human hands. We will follow armies against Persia and against a new faith called Islam, sweeping out of the desert like a storm. We will discover the secret weapon that saved a capital from annihilation and witness the betrayal that broke an empire's heart. This is a story of extraordinary endurance, of an empire that called itself Roman long after Rome was gone, and that held the line between East and West for 1,000 years. But before we begin, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight, so I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. And now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away, and let us travel back to a city built on 7 hills above the water, where the scent of incense drifted through marble halls, and the Roman Empire, against every expectation of history, refused to die. To understand why the Eastern Empire lived on, we must go back a century and a half earlier, to the year 330. The Roman Empire had grown too vast for one man to govern from one city. Its western provinces faced constant pressure from Germanic tribes along the Rhine and Danube. Its eastern provinces, richer and more populous, faced their own threats from Persia. The Emperor Constantine made a decision that would reshape the world. He chose a small Greek fishing town called Byzantium, perched on a peninsula where Europe nearly touches Asia, and he rebuilt it as a new capital. He named it after himself, Constantinople. The location was not an accident. It sat on the Bosphorus, a narrow strait connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Any ship moving between the two had to pass beneath its walls. The city was bordered on 3 sides by water, the Sea of Marmara, the Bosphorus itself, and a deep natural harbour called the Golden Horn. Only one side faced open land, and that side, in time, would be sealed behind the most formidable fortifications the ancient world had ever seen. Constantine had built himself not merely a capital, but a fortress that happened to have streets and palaces inside it. For a century after Constantine, the empire remained formally unified, but split in administration between an emperor in the west and an emperor in the east. The division was meant to be temporary, a matter of convenience. It became permanent almost by accident, and then it became a matter of survival because the two halves faced entirely different fates. In the west, the pressure never let up. Wave after wave of Goths, Vandals and Huns pressed against the frontiers, and the western treasury, drained by decades of war and internal power struggles, could no longer pay for the armies needed to hold them back. Rome itself was sacked in 410 by the Visigoth king Alaric, an event that sent shockwaves through the ancient world. It was sacked again in 455 by the Vandals. By 476, when the boy emperor Romulus was quietly deposed, the Western Empire had already been a hollow shell for years. There was, in truth, little left to fall, so why didn't the other half of Rome follow it into the grave? But the Eastern Empire faced a different geography and a different fortune. Its capital was nearly impossible to besiege by land or sea at once. Its provinces, Egypt, Syria, Anatolia, were among the wealthiest and most stable in the ancient world, feeding the capital with grain and taxes that never stopped flowing. And where the West had been forced to rely increasingly on barbarian mercenaries who owed little loyalty to Rome, the East maintained a professional army and a functioning bureaucracy, one that still collected taxes with the same efficiency it had under Augustus centuries before, but geography and gold could not, on their own, decide what Rome's fall actually meant. That question fell to one man alone. There was one man who understood better than anyone just how differently the two halves of Rome now stood. His name was Zeno, and in 476 he was the reigning emperor in Constantinople. When the general in Italy deposed the boy Romulus, he did not declare himself a new emperor of the West. He sent Zeno the boy's imperial regalia, the crown, the purple cloak, the orb, and a simple message. One emperor was enough for the whole Roman world, and that emperor should be Zeno alone. A courtesy, a piece of diplomatic theatre, but Zeno accepted it as though it were true. In the official records of Constantinople, the Roman Empire had not ended. It had simply and rather conveniently become singular. The West was gone, in fact. In law, it still belonged to the emperor in the East, who now, alone among all his predecessors, carried the full weight of Rome's memory on his shoulders. This was the strange inheritance the Eastern emperors carried forward. They did not think of themselves as Byzantines. That word was coined centuries later by Western European scholars trying to distinguish this Greek-speaking Christian empire from the Latin Rome of antiquity. The people who lived in Constantinople called themselves Romaioi, Romans. Their emperor was the Roman emperor. Their laws descended from Roman law. Their armies marched under the same eagle standards their ancestors had carried into Gaul and Britain centuries earlier, and yet everything else about their world had changed. Their language was Greek, not Latin. Their faith was Christianity, an official religion that shaped law, art, and daily life in ways the old pagan empire had never known. Their emperor was not merely a political ruler, but God's chosen representative on earth, a sacred figure whose court was designed to reflect the majesty of heaven itself. This fusion of Roman law, Greek language, and Christian faith created something genuinely new in the world, an empire that looked backward to Augustus and forward to a Christian future at the same time. This fusion gave the Eastern Empire its extraordinary resilience. When the barbarian kingdoms of the West collapsed into feuding warlordism within a generation of Rome's fall, Constantinople endured. Its emperors continued to mint gold coins so reliable in weight and purity that they became the standard currency of trade from Britain to India. Its scholars continued to copy and preserve the works of Homer and Plato in libraries the Western kingdoms could no longer read. Its engineers maintained roads, aqueducts, and fortifications on a scale no other power in the world could match. For all this strength, the Eastern emperors could never quite let go of what had been lost. Italy, the ancestral homeland of Rome itself, now belonged to a Gothic king. North Africa, once the empire's breadbasket, belonged to the Vandals. Spain and Gaul had splintered into a patchwork of barbarian kingdoms. To the emperors in Constantinople, this was not a foreign world they had never known. It was their own house, occupied by squatters. Somewhere in the marble halls of the palace, the dream persisted that one day a Roman emperor might sail west again, not as a conqueror of new lands, but as the rightful owner returning home. That dream would remain just a dream for nearly 50 years after Romulus lost his throne. It would take a farmer's nephew from the hills of the Balkans, a man who rose through the ranks of the palace guard to become emperor almost by accident, to finally act on it. His name was Justinian, and when he took the throne in 527, he did not intend merely to rule what remained of Rome. He intended to restore it, whole, to reclaim every province the barbarians had taken, and to remind the world that the Roman Empire, however diminished, however changed, had never actually ended at all. What he could not have known was that his ambition would nearly break the empire he was trying to save, even as it produced some of the greatest triumphs the Roman world would ever see. Justinian did not look like a man destined to rule the Roman world. He had been born in a small village in the Balkan hills, far from the marble and mosaics of Constantinople, the son of peasant farmers who spoke Latin as their native tongue at a time when most of the empire had long since shifted to Greek. He owed his rise entirely to his uncle, a soldier named Justin, who had walked to the capital as a young man with nothing but ambition and a strong sword arm, and who climbed, decade by decade, through the ranks of the palace guard until, through a mixture of luck and the sudden death of a childless emperor, he found himself elevated to the throne itself. Justin was old by then, and by most accounts, he could barely read. He needed someone he trusted absolutely to help him govern, and so he sent for his nephew. Justinian arrived in Constantinople as a young man and never really left the palace again. He was, by every account, tirelessly hard-working, a man who reportedly slept only a few hours a night and spent the rest of his time absorbed in law, theology, and administration. His enemies called him the Emperor who never sleeps, not as a compliment, but as a kind of unease. There was something almost inhuman about his appetite for work. When his uncle died in 527, Justinian inherited the throne without contest. He was already, in every meaningful sense, the man who had been running the empire for years. But Justinian's story cannot be told without the woman he chose to rule beside him, and her rise was, if anything, more improbable than his own. Her name was Theodora, and she came from the lowest rung of Constantinople's society. Her father had worked as a bear-keeper for the Hippodrome, the great chariot racing stadium at the heart of the city, and after his early death, Theodora and her sisters were left with no inheritance and no protection. She went to work in the theatre in an era when actresses occupied a social position barely above beggars, and by her own later admission, and by the considerably crueler account of a contemporary historian named Procopius, her early life involved considerable hardship and exploitation. She travelled, she struggled, and at some point in her 20s, something in her changed. She turned away from the life the city had assigned her, and by the time Justinian first encountered her, she had reinvented herself as a woman of surprising intelligence, sharp political instinct, and quiet religious devotion. Roman law at the time forbade men of senatorial rank from marrying actresses. It was considered a stain that could not be washed out. But Justinian's uncle, the emperor, changed the law specifically so his nephew could marry the woman he wanted. In 525, Theodora became Justinian's wife, and 2 years later, when he ascended to the throne, she became empress, the same title once held by the aristocratic wives of Augustus and Constantine, now worn by a woman who had once performed in the Hippodrome she could now see from her palace window. By the standards of the age, this was an almost unthinkable transformation, and Justinian never treated her as a decorative consort. He gave her real authority. She received foreign ambassadors. She corresponded on matters of law and church doctrine. She was, in the truest sense, his co-ruler, and in the darkest week of his reign, it would be her nerve, not his, that saved the throne. The crisis came just 5 years into Justinian's rule, in January of 532. Constantinople's chariot races were more than sport. The two great factions of fans, known as the Blues and the Greens, functioned almost like political parties, each with its own loyalties, grievances, and capacity for violence. That winter, both factions had reason to be furious with the emperor. Taxes were high. A recent round of executions of rioters had gone wrong when 2 convicted men, one blue and one green, survived their botched hanging and were sheltered by an outraged crowd. And the general mood in the city had curdled into open resentment. On the day of the races, instead of cheering rival teams, the Blues and Greens united. They began chanting a single word, over and over, into the packed stands of the Hippodrome, Nika, victory. What followed was less a riot than an uprising. For 5 days, mobs burned through Constantinople. They set fire to government buildings, freed prisoners, and eventually declared a new emperor of their own choosing. A mild-mannered nobleman with no real interest in the job, whom they nonetheless dragged from his home to be crowned in the Hippodrome. Justinian's own palace guards began to waver. Fires spread so completely across the city centre that the flames reached the doors of the great church of Hagia Sophia itself, the building that would later be replaced by an even greater one. By the fifth day, Justinian's closest advisors, watching the city burn and the mob grow bolder, urged him to flee. Ships were prepared at the palace harbour. The imperial treasury was already being loaded aboard. It was Theodora, according to Procopius's account, who stopped him. Gathered with his ministers, weighing an escape into exile, Justinian heard his wife speak words that have survived for 15 centuries. She told the assembled men that flight might save their lives, but that for an emperor, exile was a kind of living death worse than any execution. She said that she herself had no wish to live without the title of empress, and that she would not run. And then she offered the line history remembers best, that purple, the colour of imperial silk, makes a fine burial shroud. She would rather die a ruler than live as a fugitive. Her words steadied the room. Justinian did not flee. Instead, he turned to two of his ablest generals, one of them a young officer named Belisarius, who would soon become the most celebrated soldier in the empire, and gave them a brutal task. Loyal troops were quietly moved into position around the hippodrome, where tens of thousands of rioters were still gathered, celebrating their newly crowned puppet emperor. The soldiers sealed the exits, and then they attacked. What followed was a massacre. By the time the killing stopped, somewhere in the range of 30,000 people lay dead inside the stadium, an appalling toll even by the standards of ancient warfare, let alone a domestic uprising. The puppet emperor was executed. The Nika revolt, the worst crisis of Justinian's reign, was over within hours of the decision Theodora had forced her husband to make. The city Justinian surveyed afterward was a wasteland of ash and rubble at its very heart, the old Hagia Sophia among the buildings reduced to ruin. But out of that devastation came opportunity. Justinian now had a rare and terrible gift, a cleared canvas at the centre of his own capital, and an empire, however singed, that remained entirely his. He turned to his architects almost immediately, determined that whatever rose from the ashes would eclipse anything the ancient world had built before. He also turned his gaze outward, toward Italy and North Africa, toward the western provinces that had slipped from Roman hands 2 generations earlier. The uprising that had nearly cost him everything had, in the end, cleared the way for the 2 great obsessions of his reign, to build a church without equal and to make the Roman Empire whole again. For the second of these ambitions, he would need his general, Belisarius, and an army small enough to seem, to any reasonable observer, entirely inadequate for the task ahead. Belisarius was still a young man when the Nika revolt ended in blood at his own hands, but Justinian already recognized something rare in him. He was disciplined, personally brave, and unusually loyal in a court where ambitious generals had a long history of turning their armies against the very emperors who commanded them. Justinian needed exactly this kind of man, because the project he now had in mind was audacious enough to unsettle even his own advisors. He intended to send an army across the sea to reconquer North Africa from the Vandals, a Germanic people who had seized the province a century earlier and who now ruled it as an independent kingdom, and if that campaign succeeded, he intended to reclaim Italy itself, the ancestral homeland of Rome, from the Ostrogoths who held it. Most of Justinian's ministers thought the plan was reckless. North Africa had swallowed Roman armies before. An earlier expedition, sent decades earlier to punish the Vandals, had ended in total disaster, and the treasury still remembered the cost. But Justinian was patient in the way that only a man who genuinely believed in his own destiny could be, and in 533 he gave Belisarius a force that seemed almost insulting in its modesty, somewhere around 15,000 men, a fraction of what earlier failed expeditions had used, loaded onto a fleet of transport ships and sent west into the unknown. What happened next stunned the Roman world. The Vandal king, confident and unprepared, had sent much of his own fleet away to deal with an uprising in Sardinia, leaving the African coast almost undefended when Belisarius landed. The Roman army marched swiftly on the Vandal capital, won 2 decisive battles in quick succession. Within a matter of months, an entire century-old barbarian kingdom that had once humiliated Rome collapsed entirely. The Vandal king was captured and paraded through the streets of Constantinople. North Africa, one of the richest grain-producing regions of the ancient world, was Roman again. It had taken less than a year. The victory made Belisarius the most celebrated soldier in the empire, and it also made him, in the eyes of a suspicious court, dangerous. Justinian's advisors whispered that a general capable of conquering a kingdom in a single campaign was a general capable of seizing a throne, and though Belisarius never gave any sign of such ambition, the emperor would spend the rest of the general's career alternating between reliance on his talents and quiet anxiety about his loyalty. It was a pattern that would repeat itself across the whole of the Western campaign, brilliant victories shadowed by an emperor who could never quite trust the man winning them. Encouraged by the speed of the African triumph, Justinian turned his eyes to Italy, and here the war would prove far crueler and far longer than anyone in Constantinople anticipated. Belisarius landed in Sicily in 535 and swept north with the same speed that had carried him through Africa. He took Naples after a hard siege, and then, in one of the most remarkable moments of the entire war, he marched on Rome itself. The city that had once ruled the known world had by this point become a shadow of its former self, its population a fraction of what it had been under the emperors, its ancient buildings crumbling, but it remained, in the memory of every Roman, the sacred origin point of everything the empire claimed to be. Belisarius entered it in 536 without a fight. For the first time in 60 years, a Roman army answering to a Roman emperor stood inside the walls of Rome. The Ostrogoths did not accept this quietly. They gathered an enormous army, vastly outnumbering the small garrison Belisarius commanded, and laid siege to the city for over a year. Conditions inside grew desperate. Food ran short, disease spread, and the defenders were forced to rely on the ancient walls and Belisarius's tactical ingenuity to hold out against odds that should have crushed them. At one particularly dire moment, with Gothic forces threatening to breach the city's defences, Belisarius reportedly rode out personally to rally his exhausted troops, appearing at the walls again and again in full view of both sides, a single visible figure whose presence alone seemed to steady the defence. The siege finally broke in the Romans' favour, and the Goths withdrew, but the war dragged on for years afterward, spreading across the length of the Italian peninsula in a grinding, exhausting conflict that devastated the very cities Justinian claimed to be liberating. By 540, Belisarius had captured the Gothic capital of Ravenna and effectively ended the war, an achievement so complete that the Goths themselves, in a moment of strange desperation, offered to make Belisarius their own emperor of the West if he would simply break with Constantinople and rule Italy independently. Belisarius pretended to accept the offer long enough to secure the city's surrender, then took it in Justinian's name instead. It should have been the triumphant conclusion of the reconquest. Instead, it became the beginning of its unravelling. Justinian, ever wary of his general's growing legend, recalled Belisarius to Constantinople and sent him to fight on the eastern frontier against Persia instead, leaving Italy in the hands of lesser commanders. The Goths, given breathing room, rallied under a new and formidable king named Totila, who reversed nearly everything Belisarius had won. City after city fell back into Gothic hands, including Rome itself, which changed hands multiple times over the following years, each siege leaving it more ruined than the last. By the time Justinian finally sent Belisarius back to Italy to salvage the campaign, the general found himself starved of the resources and reinforcements he needed to finish what he had started. He was hamstrung less by the enemy than by his own emperor's reluctance to fully commit. Belisarius was eventually recalled again, his final Italian campaign ending in frustration rather than triumph. It would take another general, a court eunuch named Narses, whom few had expected to become a great military commander, to finally finish the job. In 552, Narses led a fresh Roman army into Italy and crushed Totila's forces in a decisive battle, killing the Gothic king and effectively ending organised Ostrogothic resistance. Italy was Roman again, in name and in law, after nearly 20 years of continuous war. Around the same time, Roman forces also secured a foothold in southern Spain, wresting a strip of coastline from the Visigothic kingdom there. For one brief moment, Justinian could look at a map and see the Mediterranean almost encircled once more by Roman territory. Africa, Italy, a piece of Spain, all answering again to Constantinople. But the cost of this restoration was almost impossible to calculate. Italy, the ancient heart of the empire Justinian claimed to be reviving, had been fought over for 2 decades, its cities besieged and starved repeatedly, its population decimated by war and the plague that swept through the Mediterranean world in these same years. Some regions of the peninsula would not fully recover their pre-war population for generations. The imperial treasury, drained by the endless expense of maintaining armies on 3 fronts at once, never fully recovered either, and the reconquered territories, so expensively won, proved almost impossible to hold. Within a few years of Justinian's death, a new Germanic people called the Lombards would sweep into Italy and seize much of what Narses had fought so hard to reclaim, leaving the Roman hold on the peninsula fragmented for centuries to come. Justinian had achieved something no other Roman emperor would ever again come close to. He had, for a moment, made real the dream of a reunified Roman world. But he had done it at a cost that left the empire dangerously overextended, its treasury empty and its eastern frontier neglected, just as new and far more dangerous threats were beginning to gather on the horizon. The dream of the West had been fulfilled and had nearly broken the empire in the process. It was, in that sense, a perfect symbol of Justinian's entire reign, magnificent in ambition, staggering in cost, and never quite as permanent as it appeared in the moment of victory. That same restless ambition, the same refusal to accept the empire's diminished circumstances, was already being poured into another project entirely, one built not of conquest but of stone and gold and light, rising from the ashes of the very riot that had nearly ended Justinian's reign before it had properly begun. While Belisarius fought his way across Africa and Italy, Justinian was pursuing a second obsession back in Constantinople, one that would outlast every territorial gain the wars ever produced. The old church of Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, had burned to the ground during the Nika revolt, one more casualty among the many buildings the mob destroyed. Within weeks of the massacre in the Hippodrome, before the ash had properly settled, Justinian summoned 2 men to begin designing its replacement, and he made it clear that he did not want another church. He wanted something that had never existed before. The 2 men he chose were not, by the standards of the day, obvious choices for the job. Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus were not builders in the traditional sense, but scholars of geometry and physics, men more accustomed to teaching mathematics than laying foundations. Justinian seems to have wanted precisely this unconventional pairing. He was not looking for a master mason who could repeat the familiar forms of the past. He was looking for men who could solve a problem that had never been solved, how to place an enormous dome, wider and higher than any that had come before it, over a square room without the whole structure collapsing under its own weight. The traditional method for supporting a dome was to build it over a circular base, where the weight distributed evenly along a continuous curved wall. But Anthemius and Isidore designed something far bolder. They proposed to rest the dome on 4 massive arches, themselves supported by 4 great piers, with a transition between the square footprint below and the circular dome above, handled by a set of curved triangular sections called pendentives. On paper, the solution was elegant. Whether it would hold in stone and mortar was another matter entirely, and there was no way to know for certain until the scaffolding finally came down. Justinian spared no expense. Materials were gathered from across the empire: purple porphyry stone from Egypt, green marble from Greece, golden mosaic tiles that would eventually cover the upper walls and ceiling in a shimmering, otherworldly light. 10,000 workers were reportedly employed on the site at the height of construction, split into 2 teams of 5,000 men each, one working on the north side of the building and one on the south, driven by a friendly and closely managed rivalry to see which team could complete its portion first. The building rose with extraordinary speed for a project of its scale. Where a comparable structure might have taken decades, Hagia Sophia was completed in under 6 years, a pace that reflected both the emperor's impatience and the sheer scale of labour and wealth he was willing to throw at the project. The church was consecrated in 537, and legend holds that when Justinian first walked into the finished nave and looked up into the vast golden dome floating impossibly overhead, he could not contain himself. He is said to have cried out, in a moment of triumph over even the ancient Israelite king who had built the great temple in Jerusalem, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." Whether or not he spoke those exact words, the sentiment behind them was entirely genuine. Nothing like Hagia Sophia existed anywhere else in the Christian or the pagan world. Visitors describe the dome as seeming to hang suspended from heaven itself, held up not by stone but by some kind of golden chain. So thoroughly did the ring of windows at its base dissolve the visual weight of the structure above. The building was not merely beautiful. The bridge served as a working demonstration of Roman engineering pushed to its absolute limit, and that limit, it turned out, had been slightly overestimated. 20 years after its completion, a series of earthquakes shook the region, and in 558, a portion of the original dome collapsed entirely. Isidore's own nephew was brought in to rebuild it, and this time the design was adjusted. The new dome built somewhat steeper and reinforced with additional buttressing, a version sturdy enough that it has, with periodic repairs, survived to the present day. For nearly 1,000 years afterward, Hagia Sophia remained the largest enclosed space and the largest dome in the entire world, a record no other building would break until the construction of the cathedral in Florence more than 8 centuries later. Hagia Sophia stood as the physical centre of Justinian's vision of empire, but it was also, in a quieter way, a monument to survival, built directly atop the wreckage of the worst crisis of his reign. And survival itself was about to be tested on a scale no building could withstand. In 541, even as workers were still finishing the decorative details inside the new church, ships arriving in the Egyptian port city of Pelusium carried something far more dangerous than grain. Rats aboard these vessels carried fleas infected with a bacterium that had never, as far as anyone in the Roman world knew, struck a human population on this scale before. Within months, the disease had reached Constantinople itself, and what followed was a catastrophe that dwarfed every war Justinian had fought. The outbreak, which later historians would call the Plague of Justinian, tore through the capital with a speed and lethality that overwhelmed every system the city possessed for managing death. At the peak of the outbreak, contemporary accounts claim that as many as 5,000 to 10,000 people were dying every single day within the city walls. Modern historians treat the highest ancient estimates with some caution, since precise record-keeping in the chaos of a plague was nearly impossible, but even conservative modern reconstructions suggest that Constantinople may have lost 1/3 or more of its population within a matter of months. The dead accumulated faster than the living could bury them. Graveyards filled, then overflowed, and the imperial administration was eventually forced to commandeer the towers along the city's sea walls, packing corpses inside them by the thousands when there was simply nowhere else left to put them. Justinian himself contracted the disease and nearly died of it, a fact that sent a wave of panic through a court already reeling from the devastation around it, since the emperor at the time had no adult heir and no clear plan for succession should he die. He survived, one of the fortunate minority who did, but the empire he ruled over would never fully recover from what the plague had done to it. The disease did not confine itself to Constantinople. It spread outward along trade routes and military roads, moving through Italy, North Africa, Gaul, and beyond, recurring in periodic waves for the next 2 centuries and steadily eroding the population base that paid the empire's taxes and filled the ranks of its armies. Some historians estimate that the eastern Mediterranean world may have lost 1/4 of its total population or more across the full span of these recurring outbreaks, an almost incomprehensible toll that permanently reshaped the balance of power between Rome and its neighbours. The timing could hardly have been crueler. The plague arrived just as Belisarius's armies were fighting their hardest campaigns in Italy, and it drained away exactly the manpower and tax revenue Justinian needed to finish what he had started. Some historians looking back on this period have wondered whether the Italian war might have concluded far more quickly and far less destructively had the plague not struck at precisely the moment it did, denuding the treasury and the recruiting grounds just as the war's expenses were reaching their peak. It is impossible to know for certain. What is certain is that Justinian spent the final decades of his long reign presiding over an empire that looked, on the map, more magnificent than it had in generations, and that was, in reality, hollowed out by war debt and by a plague that had killed a substantial share of the people who might otherwise have filled its treasury and its armies. Justinian died in 565, an old man by the standards of his age, having ruled for nearly 4 decades. He left behind Hagia Sophia, standing, as it still does today, a legal code that would shape the laws of Europe for 1,000 years, and a Western reconquest already beginning to slip through the fingers of his successors. He also left behind an empire whose eastern frontier, neglected for decades while its resources poured into Italy and Africa, was about to face the return of its oldest and most persistent enemy. Persia had never stopped watching the Roman world, waiting for the moment when Constantinople's attention was fixed firmly on the West. That moment, Persia's kings now sensed, had finally arrived. By the time Justinian's successors inherited his exhausted, overextended empire, the greatest threat to Constantinople was no longer a question of whether an enemy might reach the city. Enemies had been reaching the city, or trying to, for centuries already. The real question was whether anything could actually get through when they arrived, and the answer to that question had been built 2 centuries earlier, under an emperor named Theodosius II, in the form of a fortification system so effective that it would turn Constantinople into perhaps the single hardest target in the ancient and medieval world. The Theodosian walls, completed in the early 5th century, were not a single wall, but a layered system of defences, stretching across the entire landward side of the city, the one side not already protected by the sea. Behind a wide moat that could be flooded with water stood a low outer wall, studded with its own towers. Behind that wall lay a killing ground, a strip of open land too narrow for a besieging army to safely manoeuvre. And behind the killing ground rose the main wall itself, a massive structure nearly 40 feet high and reinforced by 96 towers spaced along its length. Each tower was positioned to let archers cover the ground below from multiple angles at once. Any army that breached the outer defences would find itself trapped in a narrow space, exposed on all sides, before it ever reached the true heart of the city's defences. In over 1,000 years, no enemy would ever breach these walls by direct assault. When Constantinople finally did fall, it would take an entirely new category of weapon to do it, one that did not yet exist when the walls were built. The walls alone, however, could not protect the city from an attack that came by water, and Constantinople's location, surrounded on 3 sides by the sea, meant that any sufficiently large enemy fleet posed a real and constant danger. This vulnerability became a matter of desperate urgency in the later 7th century, when the empire faced a threat unlike anything Rome had encountered before, an enemy that had appeared with almost supernatural suddenness and had already, within a few short decades, swallowed entire provinces the empire had held for centuries. We will return to the full story of that enemy and how it very nearly ended the Roman Empire outright, but for now it is enough to know that by the 670s, Arab fleets, loyal to the new Islamic Caliphate, had begun a sustained assault directly on Constantinople itself, laying siege to the city almost every year for the better part of a decade, in what later became known as the First Arab Siege. In the midst of this desperate, grinding crisis, Roman engineers unveiled a weapon that would become one of the most closely guarded secrets in the empire's long history. Accounts describe it as a liquid fire that could be projected from tubes mounted on the prows of Roman warships, sprayed onto enemy vessels in a stream, where it would ignite on contact and, most terrifyingly of all, continue burning even on the surface of the water itself. Enemy sailors who had spent their whole lives around the sea, who understood water as the one reliable defense against fire, found themselves facing flames that seemed to defy that basic logic of the natural world. The weapon came to be known simply as Greek fire, and its psychological effect on Constantinople's enemies was, if anything, even more valuable than its physical destructive power. The exact formula for Greek fire has never been recovered. This was by design. The Romans treated the recipe as a state secret of the highest order, reportedly known only to a single family of craftsmen who guarded it across generations. And the secret was kept so completely that by the time the Byzantine Empire itself eventually fell many centuries later, the knowledge of how to manufacture the weapon had been lost entirely, along with the empire that had once wielded it. Modern historians and chemists have proposed various theories about its likely composition, involving some combination of crude petroleum, resin, and other flammable compounds, delivered under pressure through a device that may have functioned something like an early flamethrower or siphon. But no reconstruction has ever fully replicated the properties described in contemporary accounts, and the truth is that we simply do not know, with certainty, what the Romans of Constantinople actually built in their naval workshops. It remains one of history's genuinely unsolved technical mysteries. What we do know is that it worked, and that it arrived at precisely the moment the empire needed it most. During the first great Arab siege of Constantinople, Roman ships equipped with Greek fire tore into the besieging fleet, and the resulting devastation, combined with the impenetrable land walls holding firm against every assault from the opposite direction, eventually forced the Arab forces to abandon the siege entirely. It was a pattern that would repeat itself decades later, when a second, even larger Arab siege in 717 and 718 met the same combination of unbreakable walls and unquenchable fire, and again withdrew in failure, having lost a staggering portion of its ships and men to a Roman capital that simply refused to fall. These sieges were not minor skirmishes at the edge of empire. They were existential threats, moments when the survival of Constantinople, and quite possibly of the entire concept of a Christian Roman state, hung on the outcome of a single summer's fighting beneath its walls. Contemporary chroniclers, both Roman and Arab, describe the desperation on both sides. The Arab commanders were driven by the belief that capturing Constantinople would fulfill a prophecy and open the way to the total collapse of Christian power in the eastern Mediterranean. The Roman defenders fought with the particular ferocity of a people who understood with total clarity that there was no fallback capital, no secondary position to retreat to if the walls gave way. Constantinople was not merely the seat of government. In a very real sense, this was the last thing standing between the Islamic conquests sweeping across the Mediterranean world and the complete extinction of the Roman state, which had endured, in one form or another, for well over 1,000 years by this point. The walls and the fire, taken together, gave Constantinople a kind of reputation that spread across the medieval world, a city that could be surrounded, starved, bombarded, and besieged for years at a stretch, and that would, more often than not, simply endure until the besieging army ran out of supplies, patience, or will. This reputation was not merely a matter of pride, it shaped the strategic calculations of every power in the region for centuries. Kings and caliphs who might otherwise have coveted the fabulous wealth of the Roman capital learned, through repeated and expensive failure, that a direct assault on the city was among the least promising ways to acquire it. When Constantinople did eventually change hands, centuries later, it would happen only through a combination of circumstances so specific, so unlikely, that no one watching the failed sieges of the 7th and 8th centuries could have predicted them. But the walls of Constantinople, however formidable, could only ever protect the capital itself. They could do nothing to defend the vast provinces that stretched out behind them, the rich agricultural lands of Syria and Egypt, the ancient cities of the Roman East, that had been Roman for 6 centuries by the time Justinian died. And it was in those provinces, not at the walls of the capital, that the empire suffered its single greatest and most permanent loss. A loss that began not with the sudden arrival of a new enemy at the gates, but with an old and exhausting war against Persia that the empire, in its moment of final victory, could not have known was about to cost it almost everything it had just won. For as long as Rome had existed in the east, it had lived in the shadow of Persia. The two empires had fought one another, on and off, for the better part of 4 centuries, trading border fortresses and provinces back and forth in a rivalry so old and so familiar that it had come to feel, to the people who lived through it, almost like a permanent feature of the natural world, as unchangeable as the mountains that separated their territories. But in the early 7th century, this ancient and exhausting rivalry finally reached a crisis that neither empire would survive in the form it had known before. The war began disastrously for Rome. In 602, a brutal and unpopular emperor named Phocas seized the throne through a violent coup, and the Persian king, Khosrow II, used the resulting instability as a pretext to launch an invasion of unprecedented scale and ambition. Persian armies swept through Roman Syria, then into Roman Egypt, then deep into Anatolia itself, capturing city after city that had stood as Roman territory for centuries. In 614, Persian forces captured Jerusalem, and in an act that sent a wave of horror through the entire Christian world, they carried off the relic believed to be the true cross, the very wood on which Christ himself had reportedly been crucified, taking it back to the Persian capital as a trophy of conquest. A few years later, Persian forces took Egypt as well, severing the grain supply that had fed Constantinople for centuries, and pushing the Roman Empire to what seemed like the very edge of total collapse. The man who inherited this catastrophe was an emperor named Heraclius, who had overthrown the disastrous Phocas in 610, and now found himself ruling an empire that had lost nearly 2/3 of its territory within a single generation. Persian armies had advanced so far that they camped within sight of Constantinople's own walls across the water. For a time, it seemed entirely possible that the Eastern Roman Empire might simply cease to exist, exactly as its Western counterpart had 2 centuries earlier. Heraclius reportedly considered, in the depths of this crisis, abandoning Constantinople entirely and relocating the seat of the empire to Carthage in North Africa, a plan so drastic that the people of the capital, according to later accounts, begged him on their knees not to leave them. Heraclius did not leave. Instead, he spent several years quietly rebuilding the Roman military from what remained, melting down church treasures with the reluctant blessing of the Patriarch to pay for new soldiers and new campaigns, a decision that itself reveals how close to total ruin the empire had come. Then, in 622, he did something no Roman emperor had attempted in generations. Rather than waiting for the Persians to strike again, he took the offensive, leading his rebuilt army not toward the occupied Roman provinces, but deep into Persian territory itself, striking at the heart of his enemy's own homeland, while Persian forces remained tied down in the west. The campaign that followed was one of the most remarkable in Roman military history. For 6 years, Heraclius led his army through Armenia, the Caucasus, and into the Persian heartland, winning a string of victories against Persian forces caught off guard by an enemy fighting, for once, on its own terms, rather than defending its own soil. In 627, at a decisive battle near the ruins of ancient Nineveh, Heraclius's forces crushed the main Persian army in a battle so complete that it broke the will of the Persian state to continue the war. Khosrow II, the king who had launched the invasion 25 years earlier, was overthrown and murdered by his own son shortly afterward, and the new Persian government sued for peace on Roman terms. The true cross, carried off from Jerusalem more than a decade before, was returned, and Heraclius personally escorted the relic back into the city in a ceremony of triumph that contemporaries described as one of the most moving spectacles in the empire's long history. After a war that had lasted a generation and had nearly destroyed both empires, Rome had won. Heraclius had, against every reasonable expectation, saved the Roman world. He had almost no time to enjoy it. Even as the Roman and Persian empires lay exhausted from a war that had drained both treasuries and both armies to their absolute limits, a new power was gathering far to the south, in a part of the world that neither empire had ever considered a serious military threat. In the Arabian Peninsula, a merchant named Muhammad had begun preaching a new faith, and by the time of his death in 632, just 5 years after Heraclius's triumphant return of the true cross, that faith had united the fractious tribes of Arabia into a single, disciplined, and fervently motivated military and political force for the first time in memory. What followed stunned the entire Mediterranean world with a speed that remains almost difficult to comprehend even now. Arab armies, moving with a combination of religious conviction and battlefield discipline that neither of the exhausted old empires could initially match, struck outward from Arabia in every direction at once. In 636, at a battle along the Yarmouk River, a Roman army that Heraclius himself had helped organize was decisively defeated by Arab forces, a defeat that opened the way for the loss of Syria within the year. Jerusalem, so recently and triumphantly recovered from Persia, fell to the Arab armies in 637. Egypt, the province whose grain had fed Constantinople for 3 centuries, fell by 642. It had taken the Persian Empire more than a decade of dedicated warfare to seize these same territories a generation earlier. The Arab conquests took barely 6 years. Heraclius, watching from Constantinople as the provinces he had just spent a generation defending against Persia, fell instead to this new and unforeseen enemy, is remembered by later chroniclers as having uttered a single sorrowful line while Roman forces evacuated Syria for the final time, a farewell to a land he knew the empire would likely never fully recover. Farewell, a long farewell to Syria. He died in 641, a broken man by most accounts, having lived to see nearly everything he had fought so hard to save slip away again within a handful of years, this time not temporarily, but for good. Egypt and Syria would never return to Roman rule. Persia itself, exhausted and leaderless after its own catastrophic war with Rome, fell entirely to the same Arab armies within a few more years, extinguishing an empire that had stood in one form or another for over 1,000 years. The scale of what the Roman Empire lost in this single generation is difficult to overstate. Egypt alone had provided an enormous share of the empire's tax revenue and grain supply. Syria had been Roman or Roman-adjacent territory since the days of the Republic, centuries before Christ. North Africa, painstakingly reconquered by Belisarius under Justinian just a century earlier, fell to the same wave of Arab expansion by the 1960s, erasing the last major achievement of Justinian's Western wars entirely. The empire that had once, under Justinian, briefly encircled much of the Mediterranean, now found itself reduced to a fraction of its former territory, essentially Anatolia, a handful of territories in the Balkans and southern Italy, and the capital itself. It was, in territorial terms, the single most catastrophic loss in the entire history of the Roman state, arguably even more severe than the collapse that had ended the Western Empire 2 centuries before. Remarkably, though, the Eastern Empire did not fall. It bent violently and permanently, losing provinces that would never return to Roman rule, but it did not break. The core of the state, centered on Anatolia and the walls of Constantinople, held. This resilience owed a great deal to reforms that followed in the decades after this catastrophe, as the diminished empire reorganized its remaining territory into new military and administrative districts designed to raise troops and defend the heartland with an efficiency the sprawling older provincial system had never required. It also owed a great deal, quite simply, to the walls and the fire we have already come to know. The fortifications that turned back Arab siege after Arab siege in the following decades, and ensured that, whatever else the empire lost, it did not lose the one city upon which everything else depended. What emerged from this age of catastrophe was a smaller, harder, more defensible empire, Greek in language now more thoroughly than ever, its ancient Latin traditions fading, its identity increasingly focused inward on Constantinople and the Anatolian heartland that fed and defended it. It would take centuries for this reduced empire to even begin recovering some of its lost ground, and it would never again come close to the scale Justinian had briefly achieved. But it had survived the worst catastrophe of its long history, survived the simultaneous exhaustion of a generational war with Persia and the sudden, unforeseeable eruption of an entirely new civilization out of the Arabian desert. Having endured this twin catastrophe, the empire now entered a long period of consolidation and slow recovery, one that would eventually produce a golden age of its own, before a very different kind of crisis, born not from a foreign invasion but from a schism within Christianity itself and a catastrophic defeat on its own soil, would set the stage for the empire's next great unravelling. The empire that emerged from the catastrophes of the 7th century was smaller, poorer, and more embattled than the one Justinian had ruled, but it was also, in its own way, more resilient. Stripped of the rich but distant provinces of Egypt and Syria, its identity now concentrated almost entirely on Anatolia and Constantinople, it spent the 8th and 9th centuries fighting a long, grinding, and often desperate struggle simply to hold what remained. Not until the year 867, when a new dynasty took the throne, did the empire finally begin to do more than merely survive. The Macedonian dynasty, named for the region its founder came from, rather than any connection to the ancient kingdom of Alexander, oversaw what historians now consider the empire's second golden age. Under a series of capable emperors, Roman armies pushed back into territory lost centuries earlier, reclaiming portions of Syria and driving deep into Bulgaria. One emperor, Basil II, fought these campaigns so thoroughly that he earned the grim nickname Bulgar Slayer. After one battle, he reportedly ordered the blinding of thousands of captured Bulgarian soldiers. He sent them home in groups of 100, each group led by a single man left with one eye, so that the Bulgarian king could see with his own eyes what had become of his army. It is a story that has been retold and perhaps embellished across the centuries, but whether every detail is precisely accurate, it captures something true about the era, an empire once again capable of projecting real power over its neighbours, and willing to do so with a ruthlessness that matched its renewed ambition. This military recovery was matched by a genuine cultural flowering. Scholars in Constantinople copied and preserved classical Greek texts that might otherwise have been lost entirely, and the imperial court became a centre of learning and art that outshone anything happening in Western Europe at the time. Byzantine missionaries, most famously two brothers named Cyril and Methodius, carried Christianity and a new alphabet of their own, devising into the Slavic lands to the north a linguistic and religious legacy that would shape the culture of Russia and the Balkans for 1,000 years afterward, long after the empire that sent these missionaries had itself disappeared. But even as the empire recovered its military and cultural confidence, a fracture was widening in the one institution that had always bound the Roman world together across its vast diversity of language and geography, the Christian Church. For centuries, the churches of Rome in the west and Constantinople in the east had maintained an uneasy partnership, sharing a common faith while disagreeing with growing frequency on matters of theology, ritual, and above all, authority. The Bishop of Rome, the Pope, claimed a supreme authority over the entire Christian world as the successor to Saint Peter. The Patriarch of Constantinople and the Byzantine emperors who stood behind him rejected this claim entirely, regarding the Pope as one bishop among several, senior in honour perhaps, but not in actual authority over the Eastern Church. These tensions had simmered for centuries, but in 1054 they finally boiled over into what became known as the Great Schism. A papal delegation arrived in Constantinople that year to resolve a set of long-standing disputes, and the negotiations collapsed so completely that the leader of the delegation marched into Hagia Sophia itself during a church service and laid a formal document of excommunication directly on the altar, condemning the Patriarch of Constantinople and, by extension, the entire Eastern Church. The Patriarch responded in kind, excommunicating the papal delegation right back. Neither side, at the time, fully understood that this exchange of furious condemnations would harden into a permanent division. The split between what became the Roman Catholic Church in the West and the Orthodox Church in the East has never been formally healed, even to this day, and it would have consequences for Byzantium far beyond theology, poisoning relations between Constantinople and Western Europe at precisely the moment the empire could least afford new enemies. The schism alone might have remained a distant ecclesiastical quarrel, felt more strongly by priests and theologians than by soldiers and emperors, had it not been followed so quickly by a military disaster that exposed just how vulnerable the empire's long eastern frontier had become. In the mid-11th century, a new power was rising in Central Asia, a Turkish people called the Seljuks, who had converted to Islam and were expanding westward with the same speed and religious conviction that had once carried the Arab conquests across the Roman East 4 centuries earlier. Seljuk raiders began probing into Roman Anatolia, the very heartland the empire had spent centuries defending and recovering, and by 1071, the reigning emperor, Romanos IV, decided the threat could no longer be managed through diplomacy or border skirmishes alone. He raised a large army by the standards of the shrunken 11th century empire, and marched east to confront the Seljuk Sultan directly. The two armies met near the fortress town of Manzikert in eastern Anatolia, and what followed was one of the most consequential defeats in Roman military history. The battle itself was closely fought, but it turned catastrophically against the Romans when a subordinate commander withdrew his portion of the army at a critical moment. Historians still debate why, whether through treachery, miscommunication, or simple panic. Whatever the cause, the withdrawal left the emperor's own forces exposed and surrounded. Romanos fought on with his remaining guard until he himself was wounded and captured, an almost unthinkable humiliation for a Roman emperor who was brought before the Seljuk Sultan not as a conquering enemy but as a prisoner. The Sultan, by most accounts, treated his captive with surprising courtesy, and the peace terms that followed were not especially harsh in themselves. But the political chaos that erupted back in Constantinople once news of the emperor's capture arrived proved far more damaging than the battle itself. Rival factions seized the opportunity to fight over the throne, and in the resulting civil wars, the Anatolian frontier, the empire's most valuable recruiting ground and tax base, was left essentially undefended. The Seljuks, who had not even set out to conquer Anatolia when the campaign began, poured into the resulting power vacuum almost by accident, and within a decade, the empire had lost the great majority of the Anatolian plateau, the region that had served as the core of its military manpower and economic strength since the disasters of the 7th century. The empire would never fully recover from the loss, at least in territorial terms. Manzikert did not end the Roman Empire, and it would endure for nearly 4 more centuries after this defeat, but it marked the permanent loss of the deep, defensible heartland that had allowed the empire to survive every previous catastrophe. From this point forward, Constantinople itself, and the narrowing ring of territory immediately around it, would matter more and more, while the empire's capacity to absorb further losses grew steadily thinner. It was this weakened and territorially diminished empire that, roughly 2 decades after Manzikert, found itself in the curious position of asking Western Europe for help, a request born of the very schism that had divided the Christian world just decades earlier, and one that would eventually bring waves of Western knights, soldiers, and opportunists flooding into the Eastern Mediterranean under the banner of a movement history would remember as the Crusades. The Byzantines had hoped for mercenaries, disciplined soldiers to help retake lost Anatolian territory under Roman command and Roman terms. What arrived instead, across more than one wave of crusading armies over the following century, was something far larger, far less controllable, and, in time, far more dangerous to Constantinople than the Seljuks had ever been. The empire that had survived Persia, survived the armies of Islam, and survived its own religious schism, was about to discover that its most catastrophic betrayal would come not from a rival faith at all, but from soldiers who marched beneath the same cross that hung above the altar of Hagia Sophia itself. By the final years of the 12th century, the relationship between Constantinople and Western Europe had curdled into something far more complicated than simple religious rivalry. The Crusades had brought wave after wave of Western knights through Byzantine territory over the preceding century, and while these campaigns had occasionally served Byzantine interests, helping to push back Turkish gains in Western Anatolia, they had also left a residue of mutual suspicion and resentment on both sides. Westerners who passed through Constantinople came away dazzled by its wealth, but also deeply offended by what they perceived as Greek arrogance and duplicity. The Byzantines, for their part, watched wave after wave of armed Western pilgrims cross their territory with growing alarm, and had good reason to distrust the intentions of soldiers who answered to a Pope Constantinople no longer recognized as having any authority over them at all. Into this atmosphere of accumulated distrust sailed the Fourth Crusade in 1202, on a mission meant to end in Egypt, but destined instead to end disastrously and irreversibly at the walls of Constantinople itself. The Crusade's troubles began before it ever left Western Europe. The crusading army, gathered mostly from France and the German territories, had contracted with the Maritime Republic of Venice to build and crew a fleet large enough to transport the entire force to Egypt, the strategic target the Crusades' leaders had settled on as the most effective path to eventually retaking Jerusalem. But when the appointed army finally assembled at Venice in the summer of 1202, it turned out to be far smaller than originally projected. Thousands of knights had taken other routes or abandoned the campaign entirely. The force that did arrive could not raise anywhere near the sum they had promised the Venetians for the fleet already built and waiting for them. The crusade, in other words, was bankrupt before it had even crossed open water, a fact that left it dangerously dependent on whatever arrangement the Venetians, who had every incentive to recover their enormous investment, were willing to offer instead of the payment they were owed. The Venetians proposed that the Crusaders work off their debt through military service, first by helping Venice capture a rival Christian port city on the Dalmatian coast, an act that scandalized many of the Crusaders and drew a formal condemnation from the Pope himself, but one the indebted army felt it had no real choice but to accept. During the winter that followed this diversion, a second, far more consequential opportunity arrived. A young Byzantine prince named Alexios, whose father had been deposed and blinded in a palace coup some years earlier, approached the Crusader leadership with an extraordinary offer. If the Crusaders would sail to Constantinople and help restore his father to the throne, he promised to pay their entire outstanding debt to Venice, fund the remainder of their journey to Egypt, and bring the Byzantine Church under the authority of the Pope, healing the schism that had divided Christendom for a century and a half. For the Crusades' leaders, drowning in debt and increasingly desperate for any path forward, the offer was almost impossible to refuse, even though it meant diverting a crusade meant for the Holy Land toward the capital of a fellow Christian empire instead. In the summer of 1203, the Crusader fleet arrived before the towering sea walls of Constantinople, and the city's defenders, confronted with an army flying Crusader banners rather than the Turkish or Arab forces they had faced in every previous siege of living memory, were caught in a state of genuine confusion about how to respond. After a chaotic initial assault, the reigning usurper fled the city, and the young prince Alexios was duly installed as co-emperor alongside his newly restored father, exactly as promised. The triumph, however, proved hollow almost immediately. The Byzantine treasury, it turned out, held nowhere near the sums the desperate young prince had promised his Crusader allies, having been drained by years of political instability and civil conflict that had preceded his father's overthrow in the first place. Unable to make good on his debts, Alexios found himself trapped between an increasingly hostile Crusader army camped outside his own capital's walls and a Byzantine population growing furious at a ruler who appeared to have sold his own empire's independence to foreign soldiers in exchange for a throne he could not actually afford. A popular uprising erupted within the city, and Alexios was deposed and murdered, replaced by a new emperor with no interest whatsoever in honouring debts to Crusaders who now had absolutely no path left to recover what they were owed. Faced with a bankrupt, hostile city and no legitimate emperor left willing to pay them, the Crusader leadership and their Venetian partners made a decision that would echo through history as one of the great betrayals of the medieval Christian world. Rather than abandon the campaign, they would simply take what they were owed by force from the city itself. In April of 1204, the combined Crusader and Venetian force launched a full assault on Constantinople's sea walls, the one stretch of the city's defences less formidably fortified than the great Theodosian land walls that had turned back every previous enemy for 8 centuries. Venetian ships, fitted with scaling ladders and flying bridges lashed to their masts, managed to breach the sea walls at several points, and after a chaotic and desperate defence, the greatest city in the Christian world fell, for the first time in its entire history, not to Persians, not to Arabs, not to Turks, but to an army of fellow Christians who had set out, in theory, to liberate Jerusalem. What followed has been remembered ever since as one of the most shameful episodes in the history of the Crusades. For 3 days, the city that had stood for nearly 9 centuries as the wealthiest and most sophisticated capital in the Christian world was subjected to systematic plunder. Churches were stripped of relics, gold and silver, their altars smashed apart for the precious metal beneath the surface. The magnificent bronze horses that had stood atop the hippodrome for centuries were carried off to Venice, where replicas now stand above the entrance to St. Mark's Basilica, the originals preserved just inside, a permanent monument to the sack of a rival Christian empire. Ancient manuscripts, libraries, and works of art accumulated across 9 centuries of Roman continuity were burned, scattered, or simply lost in the chaos, an incalculable and irreplaceable cultural loss that historians still mourn today. A Byzantine chronicler who witnessed the sack firsthand, Niketas Choniats, later wrote with anguish of watching soldiers who wore the cross on their shoulders behave with a savagery he had never witnessed. Even from the Muslim armies the Crusades had originally been organized to fight. The conquerors did not simply loot the city and depart. They carved up the Byzantine Empire's remaining territory among themselves, installing a Latin emperor on a newly created throne in Constantinople itself, and dividing the rest of the empire's Greek-speaking lands into a patchwork of feudal territories ruled by French and Italian lords, an arrangement historians now call the Latin Empire. Byzantine resistance did not disappear, however. Several fragments of the old empire, most significantly a rump state centered on the city of Nicaea across the water in Anatolia, preserved Byzantine institutions, Byzantine claims to legitimacy, and a determined ambition to eventually retake the capital from its Latin occupiers. That ambition was finally realized in 1261, when a Nicaean general seized the opportunity presented by a temporarily undermanned Latin garrison and recaptured Constantinople almost without a fight, restoring Byzantine rule to the city after 57 years of foreign occupation. The empire that emerged from this restoration, however, bore little resemblance to the wealthy, formidable power that had ruled before 1204. Its economy had been devastated by decades of foreign occupation and the permanent loss of trading privileges to Venetian and Genoese merchants, who now dominated Byzantine commerce from privileged enclaves within the very city the empire had reclaimed. Its territory was a fraction of what it had once controlled, and its treasury, its population, and its military strength had all been hollowed out by the sack and the occupation that followed it in ways from which the empire would never truly recover. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 stands, in the long arc of Byzantine history, as the wound the empire never healed. It had survived the Persian invasion, the sudden explosion of Islam, religious schism, and the catastrophic loss of Anatolia at Manzikert, absorbing each disaster and continuing on in some diminished but recognizable form. The sack of 1204 was different, not because it destroyed the empire outright, but because it stripped away, in 3 days of plunder, the wealth, the population, and the institutional strength that had allowed Byzantium to recover from every previous catastrophe across 9 centuries. The restored empire that ruled from Constantinople after 1261 was, in almost every practical sense, already a shadow of what it had been, a fact that would become steadily more apparent over the next 2 centuries, as the empire that had once stretched from Spain to Persia contracted, by slow and painful degrees, into little more than the city walls themselves, waiting for a final enemy that this time would not be turned away. The empire that Michael VIII Palaiologos reclaimed for Byzantine rule in 1261 was, in almost every meaningful sense, already living on borrowed time. The city itself remained magnificent, its walls still standing, Hagia Sophia still crowned with the great dome Justinian had raised 7 centuries before, but the wealth, the population, and the territory that had once supported that grandeur were gone, and they were not coming back. For the next century and a half, a succession of emperors would preside over an empire that grew smaller with almost every generation, fighting to hold on to fragments of Greece, pieces of the Anatolian coast, and eventually little more than the city of Constantinople itself and a scattering of islands, while new and far more dangerous enemies gathered on every side. The gravest of these new enemies emerged from the same region that had once produced the Seljuk Turks, who shattered the empire's Anatolian heartland at Manzikert. A new Turkish power, the Ottomans, began consolidating territory in northwestern Anatolia in the final years of the 13th century, and unlike the Seljuks before them, they showed no sign of stopping at the edge of the Anatolian plateau. Across the 14th century, Ottoman forces crossed into the Balkans, absorbing Byzantine territory piece by piece and eventually surrounding Constantinople so completely on the landward side that the city became, in effect, an isolated island of Byzantine rule inside an expanding Ottoman sea. By the early 15th century, the once mighty Roman Empire consisted of little more than the capital itself, a handful of nearby territories, and a few isolated outposts in Greece, entirely dependent on the goodwill or the distraction of an Ottoman state that could have overwhelmed it at almost any moment it chose. That moment finally arrived in 1453, under a young and fiercely determined Ottoman Sultan named Mehmed II, who had inherited his father's throne at the age of 19 and had made the conquest of Constantinople the defining ambition of his young reign. Mehmed understood, as every previous attacker across 8 centuries had eventually learned, that the city's ancient Theodosian walls represented the single greatest obstacle standing between him and the prize he wanted. He resolved to overcome them not through patience or blockade, but through a weapon that had never before been deployed on this scale, and that would finally render obsolete the very defences that had turned back every enemy since the walls were first raised. Mehmed commissioned a Hungarian engineer named Orban, who had reportedly first offered his services to the Byzantines and been turned away for lack of funds, to cast a series of massive bronze cannons, including one so enormous that it required dozens of oxen and hundreds of men to haul it into position outside the city, and that could fire stone cannonballs weighing well over 1,000 pounds. Nothing built to withstand siege warfare in the ancient or medieval sense had ever been designed to survive sustained bombardment from artillery of this scale, and when Mehmed's forces began their siege in the spring of 1453, laying a ring around the landward walls, while his fleet blockaded the sea approaches, the massive guns began the slow, thunderous work of doing what no army had managed in over 1,000 years, pounding gaps directly into the ancient fortifications that had once seemed eternal. The reigning Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, commanded a defence force that was almost pitifully small for the task before him, somewhere in the range of 7,000 or 8,000 men, including a contingent of Genoese soldiers under a skilled commander named Giovanni Giustiniani, who had arrived to help defend a cause not strictly his own, facing an Ottoman army that numbered in the tens of thousands. For nearly 2 months, this desperately outnumbered garrison held the line against constant bombardment and repeated assaults. Each night, they repaired breaches in the walls with whatever timber and rubble they could gather. It was a defence so determined that it briefly gave the besieged population reason to hope the ancient pattern might hold once more, that Constantinople might once again outlast an enemy at its gates, as it had so many times before. It did not hold. In the early hours of the 29th of May 1453, after weeks of bombardment had finally opened a breach that could not be fully repaired, Mehmed launched a final, overwhelming assault, throwing wave after wave of troops against the weakened defences until the exhausted garrison, thinned by weeks of continuous fighting, could no longer hold the line. Giustiniani, the Genoese commander, whose leadership had anchored much of the defence, was severely wounded and carried from the walls. A loss that broke the morale of the defenders at the critical moment the line finally gave way. Constantine XI, according to the accounts that have survived him, tore off the imperial insignia that marked him as emperor. He did not want to be captured and ransomed, or paraded as a trophy. Instead, he threw himself into the final fighting as an ordinary soldier, choosing that over surviving the fall of the city he could not save. His body was never conclusively identified afterward, and he passed into legend rather than into a marked grave, the last Roman emperor, dying in the breach of the walls that had defended his empire for 11 centuries. Ottoman forces poured into the city, and Mehmed himself, it is recorded, rode to Hagia Sophia and ordered that the ancient church be converted immediately into a mosque, a use it would serve for nearly 5 centuries afterward. The Roman Empire, the direct, continuous, unbroken descendant of the state founded by Augustus 15 centuries earlier, the empire that had survived the fall of Rome itself, survived Justinian's plague, survived the armies of Persia and the sudden eruption of Islam, survived its own schism with Rome and the catastrophic wound of 1204, finally, irreversibly, came to an end. It had taken gunpowder, a weapon that made the ancient walls obsolete, to accomplish what no army of any kind had managed to do in over 1,000 years of trying. As with so many empires whose political existence ends far more abruptly than their cultural legacy, the story of Byzantium did not simply vanish into the smoke over Constantinople's fallen walls. Its influence had already spread, decades and centuries before the final siege, into forms that would long outlive the empire that produced them. When Byzantine scholars fled west in the years before and after the city's fall, carrying with them manuscripts of ancient Greek philosophy, science, and literature that had been preserved in Constantinople's libraries, while much of that same knowledge had been lost or forgotten in Western Europe, they became one of the genuine sparks of the Italian Renaissance, reintroducing the West to a classical inheritance it had only partially retained. The legal code Justinian had commissioned nearly a millennium before the city's fall became, through its rediscovery and study in medieval Europe, one of the foundational texts of Western legal tradition, still cited and studied in law schools today. And the religious and cultural legacy that Byzantine missionaries like Cyril and Methodius had carried northward centuries earlier had, by 1453, already taken firm root in Russia and the broader Slavic world, where Orthodox Christianity, Byzantine artistic traditions, and even Byzantine political symbolism would continue to flourish for centuries after Constantinople itself had fallen silent under a new faith and a new name. Moscow's rulers would eventually claim the mantle of a third Rome, inheriting a legacy that had begun on the shores of the Bosphorus more than 1,000 years before. To walk through Istanbul today, as the city has been known since not long after its conquest, is to walk through the layered inheritance of this extraordinary history. Hagia Sophia still stands, its vast dome still the marvel it was when Justinian first gazed up into it, its walls bearing both the Christian mosaics of the Byzantine centuries and the calligraphic medallions added under Ottoman rule, a single building holding 2 great civilizations within the same walls. Sections of the Theodosian land walls still stand as well, weathered and broken in places by the very cannon fire that finally brought them down, a visible reminder of the 8 centuries during which they simply could not be breached. The underground cisterns that once supplied the city's water during siege after siege still lie beneath the modern streets, their forests of ancient columns disappearing into dark reflecting water, a quiet, half-forgotten monument to the extraordinary engineering that had allowed a single city to outlast empire after empire that came to destroy it. We began this story with a small boy in Italy, quietly deposed from a throne that had already lost any real meaning, while 800 miles away, in a city of marble and gold, a Roman emperor continued to rule as though nothing fundamental had changed at all. It is worth returning, now, to that image, because it captures something essential about the entire story we have followed across 9 chapters and more than 1,000 years. The Byzantine Empire has often been remembered, when it is remembered at all, as a footnote to the more familiar story of ancient Rome, a strange and distant coda rather than a civilization in its own right. But it was, in truth, Rome itself, continuing on in Greek rather than Latin, in the Christian faith rather than the old gods, adapting again and again to a world that had every reason to expect it would disappear, and refusing, across 1,000 years and more, to do so. Thank you for joining me on this long journey into the past. I hope the story of this remarkable empire, so often forgotten, has brought its beauty and its endurance to life for you tonight. I wish you a calm and peaceful night.